Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Easy English Spark Channel. I'm so excited to have you here today. Get ready for an epic adventure, the legendary story of Robinson Crusoe. This is not just a thrilling survival tale, but also a perfect way to enhance your English listening and speaking skills. Join us as we follow Robinson's incredible journey, from a reckless voyage to pirate captivity, from battling storms to surviving alone on a deserted island. Will he ever escape? Or will he find a new home in the most unexpected place? Listen closely, repeat after me, and challenge yourself to speak more fluently and confidently than ever before. Let's get started and light up your English journey. Chapter 1. A Dream Against the Tide. I was born in England in the year 1632 into a family of wealth and comfort. My father was a successful merchant, a man of discipline and wisdom, originally from Germany. My mother, an Englishwoman, carried a gentle grace, always ensuring our home was warm and loving. Together they built a prosperous life for our family. I had 2 brothers and 1 sister. My father, ever the responsible man, planned a secure future for all of us. He wanted nothing more than for me to follow in his footsteps, to become a businessman, to live a stable and respectable life. But my heart longed for something else. From the earliest days of my childhood, the sea had called to me. It was not just a body of water. It was a gateway to adventure, mystery, and freedom. I would watch the ships in the harbor, their sails billowing against the sky, and dream of distant lands, of uncharted territories waiting to be explored. The stories of great sailors and daring explorers filled my mind, fueling a passion I could not ignore. My father disapproved of this desire. He had seen men throw their lives away chasing adventure, only to be swallowed by the merciless waves. He warned me, over and over again, that the sea was cruel. "It is not a life for a man of reason," he would say. "The ocean is full of danger. Disease, storms, shipwrecks, and pirates. These are the fates that await foolish young men who abandon the safety of home." But his words did not quench the fire inside me. If anything, they made my desire even stronger. By the time I was 18, my dreams had become unbearable. I could no longer ignore the pull of the sea. One evening, my father called me into his study. I knew what was coming. The air between us was heavy. He sat in his grand chair, his face serious yet concerned. "Tell me, son," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Why do you want to throw away a good life? A life of comfort, respect, and security? Why must you chase a reckless dream?" I struggled for the right words. How could I explain the hunger inside me, the longing for something beyond numbers and trade? "Father," I finally said, "I love you. I respect you. But my heart is not made for ledgers and contracts. I want to see the world, to experience life beyond these walls. I was not born to sit behind a desk. I was born to explore." He sighed deeply, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Do you understand what you are saying?" he asked. "The sea is not kind, my son. It does not care for your dreams. It will break you, take everything from you, and leave you with nothing." And then, to my shock, his eyes glistened with tears. It was the first time I had ever seen my father cry. "You are my son, Robinson," he whispered, "and I want the best for you. I do not want to lose you." For the first time, doubt crept into my mind. My father's words weighed heavily on me. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps I was chasing an illusion. That night, I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, torn between duty and desire. But my heart had already made its choice. The next morning, I went to my mother. If my father would not support me, perhaps she would understand. I found her in the parlor, reading a letter. She looked up as I entered, her kind eyes studying my face. "Mother," I said hesitantly, "I need your help." She put the letter aside and gestured for me to sit. "Tell me, my son," she said softly, "what troubles you?" I took a deep breath. "I wish to travel, Mother, to sail across the seas and see the world." Her expression changed. The warmth in her eyes faded into worry. "Oh, Robinson," she murmured, shaking her head. "I feared this day would come." I reached for her hands. "Please speak to Father. Help him understand. This is what I was meant to do." She sighed and pulled her hands away. "Your father is right," she said firmly. "The sea is a place of danger. You have everything you need here: a good life, security, a future. Why must you throw it all away?" My heart sank. She would not help me. For a year I remained at home, trapped between my father's expectations and my own desires. But fate had its own plans. On the 1st of September 1651, I visited Hull, a town by the coast. It was there that I met an old friend, a young man whose father owned a trading ship. They were preparing for a voyage to London. "Come with us," my friend said. "See if the sea is truly for you." It was an invitation I could not resist. I was not prepared for the journey, but perhaps that was the point. If I truly wished to be a sailor, I had to embrace the unknown. I did not return home that night. Instead, I boarded the ship, my heart pounding with excitement and fear. As the Izad sails unfurled and the ship drifted into the open sea, I looked back at the fading coastline of England. Had I made the right choice? The first few hours were exhilarating. The vast ocean stretched endlessly before me. The salty air filled my lungs, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly free. But then, the sky darkened. A storm was coming. The waves grew larger. The wind howled through the sails, and the ship began to rise and fall violently. My stomach churned. My hands trembled as I clung to the railing. And in that moment, as the sea roared around me, I thought of my father's words. The ocean does not care for your dreams. It will break you. Had I made a terrible mistake? Chapter 2. A Captive of Fate. I had always dreamed of adventure, of sailing across the vast ocean, discovering new lands, and experiencing the unknown. But I never imagined that my journey would take such a dark and unexpected turn. After surviving my first storm at sea, I arrived in London, still shaken but eager for more. The thrill of the ocean had not left me. Instead, it had grown stronger. I spent days wandering the docks, watching the ships and listening to the sailors' stories. Some spoke of riches beyond imagination, of trading in distant lands where gold and exotic goods flowed freely. Others told tales of hardship, of men lost to storms, disease, or worse. Pirates. One evening, as I sat at a tavern near the harbor, I overheard a conversation that changed my life forever. A merchant was speaking of a voyage to Africa. He was looking for men to assist with trade, promising a profitable return. "Come with us," he said, his voice full of confidence. "You'll see the world, and when you return, you'll be a rich man." The words were tempting. Rich, independent, free. Everything I had ever wanted. I agreed without hesitation. The voyage to Africa. Our ship set sail under clear skies, and for weeks the journey was smooth. I adapted quickly, learning the ways of a sailor, how to tie knots, navigate by the stars, and handle the ship's rigging. I felt alive, as if I had finally found my purpose. But the sea is an unpredictable master. One morning, just as the sun began to rise, a crewman in the crow's nest shouted, "Ship on the horizon!" At first, we thought nothing of it, but as the distant vessel drew closer, our captain's expression darkened. He raised his spyglass, his grip tightening. "Pirates!" he muttered. Panic spread through the crew. We were outmatched. Our ship was built for trade, not battle. The pirate vessel was fast, armed with cannons and men hungry for loot. We had no choice but to run. For hours we sailed at full speed, trying to escape. The wind was with us, but so was it with them. The pirates gained on us quickly. By midday, their ship was close enough that we could see the skull and crossbones flag fluttering in the wind. Then, the first cannon fired. The ball struck the water just beside our ship, sending a massive splash into the air. Another followed, hitting the side of our hull with a deafening crash. The impact sent me stumbling, my heart pounding. "Prepare to be boarded," our captain shouted. The attack. The pirates threw ropes with grappling hooks, pulling their ship alongside. Ours. Within seconds they swarmed onto our deck, armed with swords and pistols. Chaos erupted. The air filled with the sound of clashing steel, gunshots, and screams. I fought as best I could, swinging a cutlass I had grabbed from a fallen crewmate. But I was no soldier. I was barely a sailor. Before I could react, a powerful blow struck me from behind. Everything went black. When I awoke, I was lying on the wooden deck of the pirate ship, my hands tied behind my back. My head throbbed, and my vision was blurred. Around me, I saw the rest of my surviving crewmates, those who had not been killed, bound and kneeling. The pirates stood over us, laughing and exchanging crude remarks. One man stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down his cheek. His coat was finer than the others, his boots polished despite the rough life he lived. He was their captain. "You're lucky," he said, his voice thick with a foreign accent. "Most ships we take, we leave no survivors. But today I feel generous." He walked past us, inspecting each captive. When he reached me, he paused. "Strong enough," he muttered. Then he nodded. "You'll do." I didn't understand what he meant until later. The pirates had no use for weaklings. Those they deemed unfit for labor were thrown overboard. The rest of us were taken as prisoners, destined to be sold as slaves, or worse, a prisoner of the pirates. The days that followed were some of the darkest of my life. The pirates sailed to a hidden cove along the North African coast, a place they used as a base. There, we were divided and given to different masters. I was taken by the pirate captain himself, forced to work as a servant in his household. I was no longer a free man. My days were spent cleaning, carrying water, and preparing meals. At night, I slept on the cold stone floor, my body aching from exhaustion. Escape seemed impossible. The walls were high, the guards ruthless, and I had nowhere to go. I did not speak the language of my captors, and the desert beyond the city was as dangerous as the sea itself. But I did not give up hope. Among the other servants was a boy named Yusef. He had been captured years ago, but unlike me, he had learned the ways of the pirates. He spoke their language, knew their routines, and most importantly, he shared my hatred for them. "We must leave this place," he whispered to me one night. "But we must be careful. They do not forgive betrayal." I nodded. I had no choice but to trust him. For weeks, we waited, watching, learning. The pirate captain often took his men on raids, leaving fewer guards behind. And every few days, he took a small boat out to sea to fish. It was always the same. He brought only 2 servants with him. One morning, he chose me and Yusef. This was our chance. As we pushed the boat away from shore, my heart pounded. I knew that if we failed, death would be the only mercy we would receive. But if we succeeded, freedom was within reach. Chapter 3: Escape into the Unknown. The morning of our escape began like any other. The sun had barely risen when the pirate captain ordered me and Yusef to prepare the fishing boat. My hands trembled as I loaded the supplies, baskets, nets, and a few jugs of water. My mind raced through every detail of our plan. We had waited for this moment for weeks, watching, listening, memorizing every routine. The captain always took 2 servants with him when he went out to sea, and today, it was our turn. We knew we would never get another chance like this. Youssef and I exchanged a glance. We both knew the risks. If we failed, there would be no mercy. The captain stepped onto the boat, giving us both a hard glare. "Move quickly," he barked. "The sea won't wait for lazy hands." We pushed off from the shore, the gentle waves rocking the small vessel as we drifted into deeper waters. The land slowly faded behind us, and my heart pounded with anticipation. The perfect moment. For the first hour, we obeyed his orders without hesitation. Youssef worked the nets, pretending to focus on the task, while I rowed as if nothing was out of the ordinary. The captain sat near the bow, his back to us, scanning the horizon. He had brought his musket, but it lay beside him, untouched. A small dagger was tucked into his belt, but he was relaxed, unaware of the danger sitting just feet away. The sea was calm, the wind steady. Everything was in our favor. I caught Youssef's eye. It was time. With a deep breath, I tightened my grip on the oar. In one swift motion, I swung it with all my strength. The wood struck the back of the captain's head with a sickening crack. He grunted in pain, lurching forward, but he wasn't. Unconscious. "Traitors!" he roared, reaching for his dagger. But Youssef was faster. He lunged forward, tackling the captain, struggling to pry the weapon from his grasp. The boat rocked violently as they wrestled, the dagger flashing between them. I grabbed the musket and aimed. My hands were shaking. "Move, Youssef!" I shouted. Youssef rolled to the side just as I pulled the trigger. The gunpowder ignited with a deafening blast. The musket ball struck the captain's shoulder, sending him toppling overboard. He hit the water with a splash, his scream of rage swallowed by the waves. For a moment he thrashed, trying to stay afloat. Then he began to sink, his wounded arm too weak to keep him above water. We watched in silence as the sea consumed him. It was over. Adrift on the open sea. We had won our freedom, but at what cost? The pirate captain was dead, but we were still trapped in the middle of the ocean, with no sails, no proper navigation, and only a few supplies. We had no idea where we were or where to go. "We need to row," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We can't just drift." Youssef nodded, but the exhaustion was already setting in. We had fought hard, and now the reality of our situation was sinking in. We took turns rowing, pushing the boat forward, but the open sea stretched endlessly around us. The sun blazed overhead, burning our skin, and the salty air dried our throats. By the second day, our water supply was nearly gone. The heat was unbearable, and our muscles ached from rowing with no land in sight. "Do you think we'll find a ship?" Yusef asked, his voice hoarse. I wanted to lie, to give him hope, but I didn't know. A glimmer of hope. On the third day, just as despair began to take hold, we spotted something on the horizon, a dark shape against the endless blue. A ship. I scrambled to my feet, waving my arms frantically. "Over here! Help!" Yusef grabbed a piece of cloth and waved it like a flag. The ship was moving toward us. As it drew closer, we saw the flag it flew, a Portuguese merchant vessel. Relief washed over me. Moments later, the ship's crew spotted us. A few men leaned over the railing, shouting to one another. A small boat was lowered, and within minutes we were being pulled aboard. We collapsed onto the deck, gasping for breath. Water was pressed to our lips, and for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. The captain of the ship, a man with a thick beard and kind eyes, approached us. "You're lucky we found you," he said in Portuguese. "Where are you from?" I hesitated. How could I explain? "We were captives," I finally said. "We escaped." The captain studied us for a long moment, then nodded. "Rest now. You are safe." The journey to Brazil. The Portuguese ship was bound for Brazil, and the captain agreed to take us there. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of security. As we sailed across the Atlantic, I thought about everything that had happened: the storm, the pirates, the escape. I had left England seeking adventure, and I had found it, but it had cost me dearly. Now, as I stood at the railing, watching the endless horizon, I wondered, what would the future hold for me? Would I ever return home, or was my journey just beginning? Chapter 4. The Sugar Planter's Life. The journey to Brazil had been long and grueling, but it had also been a journey of rebirth. After weeks aboard the Portuguese merchant ship, we finally arrived at the shores of Brazil. The humid air hit me immediately as I stepped off the gangplank and onto the bustling docks. I had never seen anything like it. Green, lush landscape stretching out before me. The sounds of the market rising in the background, and the scent of salt water mingling with the exotic spices of the land. I was in a new world, a place I had never imagined, but one that was full of promise. Brazil was a land of possibility, and for the first time in what felt like years, I felt the weight of the past lift from my shoulders. The slave trade was thriving here, and there was money to be made. As a man who had known nothing but the hard life of the sea, I found the prospect of working the land oddly appealing. The captain of the ship, noticing the glint of ambition in my eyes, introduced me to a local merchant who was looking for laborers to work his sugar plantation. He spoke of riches, how sugar was in high demand in Europe, and how a successful plantation could yield great profits. But there was more than money to this proposition. The merchant spoke of Brazil's future, of a society built on trade, land, and the raw materials of the New World. The idea was simple. I would start small, buy a plot of land, and begin cultivating sugar. I was eager to make a life for myself, to build something solid out of the ashes of my past, and the more I heard, the more I was convinced this was my destiny. Building a new life. I invested what little money I had saved from the pirates' trade, buying a modest piece of land on the outskirts of the city. The land was fertile, but it required a lot of work. It was a harsh life, filled with sweat, dirt, and exhaustion, but it was honest work, and for the first time in a long while, I felt in control of my own fate. I hired a few men to help with the initial clearing of the land. We chopped down trees, dug irrigation channels, and laid the foundation for what would soon become my sugar plantation. Every day, the sun beat down mercilessly, and the work was relentless. But I found peace in it. For the first time in years, I was no longer a captive to fate. I had chosen this life for myself, and I would make it succeed. The first few seasons were difficult. The sugar plants grew slowly, and there were setbacks, storms that flooded the fields, insects that destroyed crops, and shortages of labor. There were days when I thought about giving up and returning to the sea, but I had made a promise to myself that I would see this through. And as the months passed, I began to see the fruits of my labor. The plantation slowly took shape. The sugar plants flourished, and the surrounding area grew prosperous. I started making deals with other merchants, selling my sugar to Europe and to other parts of South America. As the wealth of my plantation grew, so did my standing in the community. I was no longer just a man running from his past. I was a businessman, a landowner, a part of the new society being built here in Brazil. A new beginning. It wasn't long before my success allowed me to expand. I purchased additional land, and with it, more slaves to work the fields. The harshness of the labor, the scorching sun, and the back-breaking work were all part of the life I had chosen. But something changed in me. As I stood watching my plantation grow, I realized that I had found my place in the world. This was my new home, and the land beneath my feet was mine to shape. Yet, despite my newfound wealth and success, a part of me still felt the void. I had worked so hard to build my plantation, but I was still alone. My thoughts drifted back to England, to the family I had left behind, to the life I had lost. But there was no turning back. The past was gone, and all I could do now was move forward. One day, as I was walking through the plantation, inspecting the workers, I met a young woman who would change everything for me. She was the daughter of one of my workers, a kind, quiet girl with dark hair and a gentle smile. Her name was Isabel, and she had come to the plantation to help her father with the cooking. The moment I saw her, I was struck by her beauty. But it wasn't just her looks that caught my attention. It was the way she carried herself. There was a quiet strength in her, a grace that I couldn't ignore. She didn't speak much, but there was something in the way she moved that made me want to know more. I began finding excuses to spend time with her, to speak with her, even if it was just to ask about the weather or the work on the plantation. Over time, I began to realize that I had grown fond of her more than I ever expected. She was everything I was not: calm, patient, and kind. And though she was a worker on my plantation, she never once treated me like a master. She treated me like a man, like someone who could be her equal. The proposal. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the fields, I found myself walking beside Isabel. The air was cooler, and the sounds of the plantation had quieted as the day came to a close. I had planned to speak to her about something that had been on my mind for days. "I've been thinking," I began, my voice uncertain, "about you, about this plantation, about what comes next." She looked at me, her brow furrowing slightly, as if trying to understand where my words were leading. "I want you to stay with me," I said finally, my heart pounding. "I know I've been so focused on the land, on the work, that I haven't stopped to think about the things that matter most. But I can't build this life alone. I need someone by my side, someone who understands what it means to make a home out of nothing. Will you marry me, Isabel?" The words hung in the air between us, and for a moment there was silence. Isabel's eyes softened, and she looked away, as if gathering her thoughts. Then, finally, she spoke. "I would be honored," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but the warmth in her words made my heart swell. I had found my new beginning, not just in the land or in the sugar I was growing, but in Isabel, in the love that had sprouted quietly between us. Together, we would build something even greater than the plantation itself. As we walked back to the house, side by side, I knew that the future was bright, the past was behind me, and the road ahead was full of possibility. Chapter 5. The Island of Isolation. For years I had fought against the sea, against fate, against the very forces that seemed determined to control my life. But no battle could have prepared me for the one I was about to face, one that I would fight alone. It began with a storm unlike any I had ever seen. The sky had been clear when we set sail from Brazil, our ship heavy with goods bound for Africa. The journey was supposed to be a short one, a quick trading mission before returning home to expand my plantation. But the sea had other plans. The wind rose without warning, howling like a beast unleashed from the depths of the ocean. The waves towered over us, crashing down with a force that sent men sprawling across the deck. The ship groaned under the weight of the storm, the wooden planks bending, cracking, as if they too were struggling to survive. Then, a deafening sound. The mast snapped. The last thing I remembered was the blinding flash of lightning splitting, the sky, the sensation of falling, and then darkness, alone in a new world. When I awoke, I was lying face down in wet sand. The roar of the ocean echoed in my ears, but the storm had passed. My body ached, my clothes were torn, and my head throbbed with pain. I forced myself up onto my hands and knees, coughing up salt water, my lungs burning. I was alive. But where was I? Slowly, I lifted my head and looked around. Before me stretched a long, empty shoreline, the golden sand giving way to dense jungle. Behind me, the wreckage of my ship lay in pieces, half submerged in the shallows. I turned in every direction, searching for any sign of life. There was none. Panic gripped my chest. Had anyone else survived? I staggered to my feet and called out, my voice hoarse and weak. Hello? Silence. I was alone. Survival begins. The first hours were filled with fear, but fear alone would not keep me alive. I needed food. I needed shelter. I needed a plan. The wreckage of my ship was my first hope. With the tide still low, I waded out to the remains, searching for anything useful. The ship had been destroyed, but some supplies had survived. I found barrels of dried food, biscuits, salted meat, some flour, a few bottles of wine, a small chest with tools, knives, an axe, a hammer, nails, a musket, and a small supply of gunpowder. It was not much, but it was enough. With all my strength, I dragged my findings to shore. My limbs trembled from exhaustion, but I had no time to rest. Night would fall soon, and I had no place to sleep. I could not risk staying on the beach. The jungle beyond was thick, its shadows deep and foreboding, but it would provide cover. I moved inland, searching for high ground, somewhere I could build a shelter. I found a small hill, partially covered by rocky cliffs, with a clear view of the beach. If a ship passed by, I would see it. There I set to work. With the axe from the wreckage, I chopped long branches, driving them into the ground to form a makeshift fence. It was weak, but it would keep wild animals at bay for the night. Inside my small enclosure, I laid palm leaves across the ground to keep myself from sleeping in the dirt. I placed my musket by my side, my ears straining for any sound in the darkness. I did not sleep. Every rustle in the trees, every whisper of wind sent my heart racing. The reality of isolation. Days turned into weeks. I had survived the storm, but survival was a constant battle. I learned to fish in the shallow waters using a spear I had fashioned from a broken oar. I gathered fruit from the trees, bananas, coconuts, berries. I prayed were not poisonous. I built a stronger shelter, using wood and stone, reinforcing the fence to keep out predators. But the worst enemy was not hunger or wild beasts. It was loneliness. There was no one to speak to, no voice but my own echoing in my mind. I began talking to myself just to hear something human. One day, I found a parrot, green, bright, watching me with curious eyes. Desperate for company, I caught it and brought it back to my camp. I taught it to say my name. Robinson, it would squawk over and over again. Hearing my own name spoken, even by a bird, was enough to keep me sane. Hope and despair. Every day, I climbed to the highest point on the island, scanning the horizon for ships. Every day, I saw nothing. I built a large fire on the beach, ready to light it if a ship ever appeared. But weeks passed, then months, and no ship came. I realized the truth. This island was not on any major trade route. No one was coming for me. I had been certain that fate had placed me here only temporarily. But as the months stretched into years, I began to wonder, was this my life now? Would I die here, alone, forgotten? A discovery that changed everything. Then, one fateful day, everything changed. It was early morning when I set out along the beach, as I had done countless times before. My footprints dotted the sand, an endless trail of repetition. But then I saw something that made my breath catch. Footprint, not mine. I froze, my blood turning cold. I had not seen another soul since the day I washed ashore. But now, clear as day, was the unmistakable mark of a human foot, pressed into the wet sand. Someone else was here. I spun around, scanning the trees, the cliffs, the distant shoreline. My pulse pounded in my ears. Was I being watched? Were they, friend or foe? For the first time in years, I felt true terror. I had prayed for human contact. But now that it was here, I was afraid of what it might bring. Chapter 6. Learning to Live Again. It had been several months since I first set foot on the island. The days blended together in a haze of survival, one day indistinguishable from the next. My body had begun to adjust to the harshness of my environment, but my mind had begun to fade. I had tried to fight against it, tried to cling to the notion that help was coming, that this was only temporary. But the realization had started to settle in. This was my life now. There was no rescue. The world outside, the world I had once known, was as far away as the stars. Each morning, I would wake with the sun, my body sore from the constant labor, but my mind still clouded by the solitude. I spent hours walking the shoreline, scanning the horizon, hoping against reason that I might see the glint of a ship's sails or hear the faint sound of a bell in the distance. But every day the view remained unchanged, vast, endless ocean. The island stretched before me, wild and untamed, as if the land itself had no memory of my arrival. I had always been a man of action, driven by purpose. But here, there was no greater purpose beyond survival. I had learned to fish, to gather fruit, to make tools from the wreckage of my ship. Yet every new skill I acquired seemed to bring me no closer to the life I once had. I had built a shelter, reinforced it with palm leaves and wood, and crafted a small garden near the base of the hill. I was self-sufficient in a way, but I was not fulfilled. The work was endless, and the solitude suffocating. One morning, as I walked the beach, I stumbled upon something unexpected. At first, I thought it was just another piece of driftwood, washed ashore by the ever-present tide. But as I drew closer, I realized it was a large crate, still sealed and intact. My heart raced. I couldn't believe it. Could it be that the sea had finally delivered something useful to me? I knelt down, my hands shaking as I pried the crate open with the knife I had fashioned months earlier. Inside, I found tools, real tools, not the crude implements I had been making myself. There were saws, hammers, and nails. There were also items I hadn't dared dream of. A roll of fabric, a few jars of preserved food, and even a bottle of fresh water. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a flicker of hope. With the new tools, I worked tirelessly for days, reconstructing my shelter and expanding my small garden. I used the fabric to make new clothes for myself, garments that were better suited to the heat of the island than the tattered rags I had been wearing. I made a better fishing net, and for the first time, I felt a sense of progress, a sense of purpose. I was learning to live again, not just to survive, but to build, to improve, to reclaim a piece of my old self. A new routine. As the weeks passed, a new routine emerged. The work became familiar, comforting even. I would wake at dawn, catch my fish, and then tend to the garden. I had planted vegetables, tomatoes, cucumbers, and beans, and slowly they began to sprout, offering a much-needed variety to my diet. In the afternoons, I would gather firewood and forage for fruit, and in the evenings, when the sun set and the world quieted, I would sit by the fire, my thoughts a little clearer than before. The days were long, but they held a rhythm. I began to appreciate the routine, the stability it offered in a world that had otherwise been chaotic. The isolation, which had once felt like a weight on my soul, now seemed almost natural. I had adapted to it. The constant work, the constant struggle. It was all part of the process of survival. But even as I became accustomed to the island's rhythm, I couldn't ignore the gnawing emptiness inside me. I had learned how to survive, but I had not learned how to live. I had built shelter, I had found food, and I had made a home. Yet, with each passing day, the silence pressed in on me, filling the spaces left by the absence of human companionship. I began to realize that survival wasn't enough. I needed something more. I needed connection, a friend in the wilderness. Then, one afternoon, something extraordinary happened. As I was walking through the jungle, gathering fruit, I heard a rustling sound behind me. At first, I thought it was an animal, a wild boar perhaps, or a monkey. But when I turned, I froze in disbelief. It was a man, standing in the shadows of the trees, watching me. I couldn't believe my eyes. After all this time, all these years of isolation, here was another human being, as if the island itself had brought him to me. His clothes were tattered, his skin dark from exposure to the sun, but he was alive. I felt a rush of emotions, fear, excitement, disbelief. Could he be a pirate, another captive of the island, or a native? "Who are you?" I asked, my voice hoarse from months of silence. He stepped forward slowly, as if unsure of me, his eyes wary. "I am Friday," he said in broken English. Friday. It felt like the weight of years had been lifted in that single moment. I had someone to talk to. I had a companion, a new beginning. Friday explained that he had been shipwrecked just as I had. But unlike me, he had managed to survive for only a few months before being captured by a group of natives who had brought him to the island. He had escaped from them just days before I found him. We talked for hours, exchanging stories and learning each other's language. I taught him English, and in return, he taught me the ways of the island, how to find fresh water, how to identify edible plants, how to hunt the wild animals that roamed the jungle. We worked together to build a larger shelter, one that could accommodate both of us. The land, which had once felt so isolating, now felt full of potential. Together, we hunted, fished, and worked the land. Friday became not just a companion, but a friend. Someone who helped me find joy in the simple things again. We would sit by the fire at night, sharing stories and dreams of the world beyond the island, of places we might one day see, of things we might one day accomplish. For the first time since my shipwreck, I began to feel that I could live again. I could build a future, a life beyond mere survival. I had someone to share it with, someone who understood what it was like to be lost and found again. The island, which had once been a place of isolation and despair, had become a home, a place of growth, of companionship, and of hope. Chapter 7. The Shadow of the Cannibals. For a time, life on the island seemed almost peaceful. With Friday by my side, the unbearable loneliness that had once suffocated me was gone. We worked together, shared meals, and built a friendship that felt stronger than any bond I had formed in my past life. The island, which had once been my prison, now felt like a home. But peace, as I had learned time and again, was always fleeting. The first sign of trouble came in the form of distant smoke. It was late in the afternoon when I noticed it, a thin column rising in the sky just beyond the farthest hills of the island. My heart pounded. There was no natural cause for such a fire. Someone else was here. I called Friday to my side and pointed toward the smoke. His expression darkened immediately. "Cannibals," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had heard of them before, tribes that roamed the coasts, capturing prisoners for gruesome rituals. But I had never thought they would come here. "Are you sure?" I asked, hoping for a different answer. Friday nodded gravely. "They come sometimes, not stay. They bring men from other islands. Kill them. Eat them." The word sent a wave of nausea through me. The thought of such savagery taking place on the very island where I had built my new life was unbearable. "How many?" I asked. "Many," Friday said. "Always many. A silent watcher in the dark." That night, we climbed to a high vantage point near our shelter, carefully keeping to the shadows. From there, we could see the beach where the smoke had risen earlier. And sure enough, the truth was worse than I had imagined. A large group of men stood around a roaring fire, their bodies painted with strange symbols, their voices raised in wild guttural chants. Near the edge of the fire lay a horrifying sight. Several bound prisoners, lying motionless, waiting for their gruesome fate. I felt a surge of fury rise within me. How could such cruelty exist? How could men do this to one another? I reached for my musket, my fingers tightening around the stock. I wanted to do something, anything, to stop this madness. But Friday caught my arm. "No," he said, shaking his head urgently. "Too many. You shoot one, others come. Kill us both." I gritted my teeth, hating the truth in his words. There were at least 30 of them, armed with spears and bows. Even with my firearms, I would stand no chance against them. All I could do was watch. As the night dragged on, I burned their faces into my mind, memorizing their movements, their numbers. If they had come once, they would come again. And if I wanted to protect myself, if I wanted to protect Friday, I would need a plan, preparing for war. The next morning, as the sun rose over the island, Friday and I returned to our shelter. Neither of us had slept. "They will come back," Friday said grimly. I nodded. "Then we must be ready." For the next few weeks, we worked tirelessly to fortify our home. We reinforced the fences around our shelter, turning them into walls strong enough to withstand an attack. We created hidden traps in the surrounding jungle, pits covered with leaves, sharpened stakes placed in strategic locations. I taught Friday how to use the musket, and he in turn taught me how to fight with the weapons of his people: spears, bows, knives. We trained daily, practicing silently in the dense jungle. I was no longer just a survivor. I was a soldier now, preparing for a battle that would determine our fate. But the fear never left me. Would it be enough? A chance to strike. Weeks passed without incident. The beach remained empty, the jungle silent. I began to wonder if perhaps the cannibals had moved on, if our fear had been for nothing. Then, one morning, Friday returned from scouting with a look of urgency on his face. "They come," he said. We climbed to our vantage point once more, and there they were. 3 large canoes, cutting through the waves, gliding toward our island like shadows on the water. This time, there were fewer of them. No more than 20 compared to the 30 or more I had seen before, and then I saw it. Among them 2 new prisoners bound and helpless. I turned to Friday. "Can we save them?" Friday hesitated. "Dangerous, but maybe." I nodded. "Then we do it." We could not let another massacre happen on our island. If we could strike first, if we could take them by surprise, perhaps we stood a chance. The battle begins. As the cannibals dragged their prisoners onto the sand, we moved silently through the trees, positioning ourselves just outside their camp. My hands were steady as I raised my musket. I had only one shot before they realized what was happening. I had to make it count. I took a deep breath, aimed at the largest man standing over the prisoners, and fired. The musket roared, the bullet tearing through the air. The man collapsed instantly. For a moment, there was silence, then chaos. The cannibals turned in panic, searching for the source of the attack. Before they could react, Friday let loose an arrow, striking another man down. I reloaded as quickly as I could while Friday rushed forward, spear in hand. The prisoners, sensing their chance, struggled against their bonds, kicking at their captors. I fired again, striking another cannibal before they finally spotted us. A scream rang through the night, and the warriors charged. Friday fought like a man possessed, his spear a blur as he cut down the first man who came too close. I backed him up with my musket, reloading and firing as fast as I could. But there were too many of them. One of them lunged at me with a spear, and I barely dodged in time. The weapon grazed my arm, tearing through my sleeve. I swung the butt of my musket into his face, sending him sprawling. We had to end this. I turned to Friday. "We have to make them run." Friday nodded and let out a fierce battle cry, lifting a torch from their own fire and hurling it into their supplies. The flames erupted instantly, spreading fast. The sight of the fire, combined with the loss of several of their men, broke their spirit. One by one, they turned and fled, running for their canoes, scrambling to escape the island. We stood there, breathing hard, watching as they disappeared into the waves. A new beginning. When the battle was over, we freed the prisoners. 2 men from a neighboring island. They spoke a language I did not understand, but their gratitude was clear in their eyes. That night, as the fires burned low, I looked at Friday, at the men we had saved, at the land we had fought to protect. The island had once been my prison. Now it was my kingdom, and I would defend it, no matter the cost. Chapter 8. The Arrival of Friday. The island had been my prison for so long that I had nearly forgotten what it felt like to see another human face. I had resigned myself to solitude, convinced that I would live and die in isolation. But fate as always, had its own plans. It all began one morning as I walked along the beach, scanning the horizon as I always did. The sea was calm, the sky a brilliant shade of blue, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to relax. But then, I saw something that made my heart stop. A canoe. It was gliding toward the shore, moving swiftly through the waves. At first, I thought it was empty, just another piece of wreckage carried by the tide. But then I saw them, figures hunched inside, paddling furiously. My stomach twisted into a knot. Had the cannibals returned? I dropped to my knees, pressing myself against the rocks, watching. The canoe was not alone. 2 others followed behind it, and as they drew closer, I could see them clearly. 6 men, their bodies painted with strange symbols, their faces set, in grim determination, prisoners. I counted 3 men bound at the wrists, forced to kneel at the front of the first canoe. Their heads were bowed, their faces grim. They were captives, being brought to the island for a fate I did not want to imagine. For a long moment, I remained frozen, my mind racing. I had fought the cannibals before and driven them away, but they had returned. And now, they had brought victims to slaughter. I could not let it happen. A desperate plan. I turned and ran back to my shelter, my mind working frantically. I had my musket, but I only had a handful of gunpowder left. There were too many of them to fight head-on. If I attacked blindly, I would surely be killed. But I had one advantage: the element of surprise. I retrieved my musket, my pistol, and my knife, then grabbed my powder horn and pouch of bullets. My heart pounded in my chest as I made my way toward the high ground overlooking the beach. The canoes landed moments later. The cannibals dragged their prisoners onto the shore, shoving them roughly onto the sand. One of them shouted something in a language I did not understand, and the others laughed. Then they began preparing the fire. I gritted my teeth. I had to act quickly. I positioned myself behind a thick cluster of trees, raised my musket, and took aim at the nearest man. My hands were steady as I squeezed the trigger. The explosion shattered the silence. The shot struck the cannibal in the chest, sending him sprawling onto the sand. Chaos erupted instantly. The others whirled in confusion, their eyes wide with shock. Before they could react, I fired again, my pistol kicking back against my palm. Another man fell, clutching his side. I had only seconds before they spotted me. Dropped my weapons and charged forward, knife in hand. The prisoners, still bound, watched in stunned silence as I rushed toward them. One of the cannibals lunged at me, raising a spear. I dodged, slashing out with my knife, catching him across the arm. He howled in pain, stumbling back. The rest of them hesitated, unsure whether to fight or flee. I didn't give them a chance to decide. I grabbed one of the prisoners. He was young, barely more than a boy, and cut the ropes binding his wrists. "Run!" I shouted. He hesitated for only a moment before bolting toward the jungle. I freed the second prisoner just as the remaining cannibals regrouped. One of them raised a club, his face twisted with rage. Before he could strike, an arrow flew through the air, striking him in the neck. I turned, stunned. It was the boy, the one I had freed. He had grabbed a bow from the fallen cannibal and was now standing beside me, breathing hard. We exchanged a glance. Then we ran. The escape. The jungle swallowed us whole as we crashed through the undergrowth, our feet pounding against the earth. Behind us, the remaining cannibals shouted in rage, their voices growing fainter as we pushed deeper into the forest. We ran until our lungs burned, until the sound of pursuit had faded completely. Only then did we stop, collapsing onto the damp ground. For a long moment, we simply sat there, gasping for breath. Then I turned to look at him, the boy who had fought beside me. He was young, perhaps no older than 20. His skin was darkened by the sun, his hair wild and unkempt. There was fear in his eyes, but also something else, something stronger. "Who are you?" I asked. He hesitated, then placed a hand over his chest. "Friday," he said. His voice was rough, unused to my language, but the name was clear. "Friday," I repeated. He nodded. A silence stretched between us, but it was not an uncomfortable one. This was the moment everything changed. I had spent years alone, learning to live in solitude, believing that I was the only man on this island. But now, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was not alone. I had a companion, I had a friend. A new life begins. That night, we returned to my shelter. I showed Friday my home, my crops, my tools. He watched everything with wide eyes, nodding in understanding. We spoke little at first. His English was broken, but he learned quickly. Over the next few weeks, I taught him everything I knew, names of the plants, the way to catch fish, the method for building shelter. And in return, he taught me his ways, how to move silently through the jungle, how to track animals, how to build stronger weapons from the land itself. Day by day, he became more than just a rescued prisoner. He became my ally, my student, my friend. One afternoon, as we sat by the fire, I turned to him and asked, "Do you want to go home?" Friday hesitated. His gaze drifted toward the horizon, toward the distant lands that lay beyond the sea. Then slowly he shook his head. "Home. Here," he said simply. I stared at him, surprised. He meant it. He had chosen to stay. And in that moment, I realized something profound. I had spent years waiting to be rescued, dreaming of returning to England, of reclaiming the life I had lost. But now, for the first time, I was beginning to wonder, was I still a man waiting to be saved, or had I finally found a place where I truly belonged? Chapter 9. Hope and a Plan for Freedom. For years, I had lived on the island with no hope of rescue, but now, for the first time, that hope burned inside me like a fire that refused to die. The arrival of Friday had changed everything. No longer was I alone in my struggle. No longer did the island feel like a prison. But even with this newfound companionship, a question lingered in my mind. Would I ever leave this place? At first, the thought had seemed impossible. But now, with Friday's help, it didn't seem so far-fetched. He had knowledge of the sea, of nearby lands, and of routes the native tribes used to travel between islands. If anyone could help me escape, it was him. And so, as we sat by the fire one evening, watching the flames dance in the dark, I turned to him and asked the question that had been weighing on my heart. Friday, do you want to be free? He looked at me, his dark eyes unreadable. For a long moment, he was silent. Then he nodded. Yes, he said simply. I took a deep breath. Then let's make a plan. The dream of escape. The first step was gathering information. Friday told me that his people lived far across the sea on a large island. He did not know how far exactly, but he believed it was possible to reach. He also spoke of other islands, some of which had contact with traders, men who might take us back to civilization if we could reach them. I listened carefully, my mind racing. If what he said was true, then we had a real chance. But there was one problem. The cannibals, Friday reminded me. They come back, always come back. He was right. Even if we built a boat and set sail, we could not risk leaving the island unprepared. If the cannibals returned while we were at sea, they could destroy everything we had worked for. We needed to deal with them first. Laying the trap. Over the next few weeks, we worked tirelessly to prepare for the next cannibal attack. We reinforced our shelter, creating hidden walls within the jungle that would allow us to fire upon intruders from a distance. We dug deep pits in the most commonly used paths, covering them with branches and leaves. We built weapons, extra spears, bows, and arrows, all hidden in strategic locations. It was exhausting work, but we knew it was necessary. Then, one morning, Friday came running back from the shoreline. "They come," he said, breathless. I grabbed my musket and followed him to our vantage point. Sure enough, 3 canoes were approaching. They carried at least 20 men, their bodies painted with war markings. But this time, something was different. There were no prisoners. They not kill. "Today," Friday whispered. "They hunt." I frowned. "Hunt what?" Friday hesitated. Then his expression darkened. "Us. The battle for survival." It was clear now. The cannibals had discovered someone was fighting back. They weren't here for a ritual. They were here for revenge. But we were ready for them. As they landed, Friday and I positioned ourselves in the trees, hiding in the shadows. We waited until they began moving inland. Then I gave the signal. A single gunshot rang out. The first man fell instantly, clutching his chest. The others froze, startled. Then Friday let loose an arrow, striking another in the neck. Panic erupted. The cannibals had never faced resistance like this before. They scattered, running for cover, right into our traps. One man stepped forward, only to plummet into a hidden pit, his scream cut short as sharpened stakes impaled him. Another turned to flee, but Friday struck him down before he could take another step. The remaining men hesitated, their confidence shaken. And then, just as we had hoped, they turned and fled, scrambling back to their canoes in terror. We had won. For the first time since I had come to this island, I felt in control of my fate, the boat of freedom. With the cannibals defeated, we turned our attention back to our escape. The boat had to be strong enough to withstand the open sea, yet small, enough for the two of us to handle. We spent weeks crafting it, using every skill and resource we had. We felled trees, carved the wood, and used animal hides to waterproof the hull. It was slow, grueling work. But with every nail driven, with every plank secured, our hope grew, stronger. At last, the boat was finished. I stood back, staring at our creation. It was not perfect, but it was ours. It was freedom. The final test. Before we could leave, there was one final test. We needed to take the boat out on a trial run to see if it could handle the sea. We pushed it into the water, climbing aboard. The waves rocked us gently at first, then grew stronger as we moved farther from shore. The boat held. We had done it. We returned to shore, our spirits high. The only thing left to do was wait for the right moment, the right winds, the right tides. And then, one morning, as we stood watching the horizon, we saw something that made our breath catch in our throats. A ship, a real ship, with sails billowing. In the wind, moving steadily toward our island. Rescue or danger? We did not know, but we would soon find out. Chapter 10. The Return of a Changed Man. The sight of the ship on the horizon filled me with emotions I had long forgotten. Hope, fear, and an overwhelming sense of disbelief. For years I had dreamed of this moment, but now that it had come, I felt unprepared. Had I truly spent so much time on this island that the thought of returning to civilization seemed foreign? Had I changed so much that I no longer belonged to the world I had once known? But there was no time for hesitation. Friday. And I stood on the shoreline watching as the ship grew closer. Its white sails billowed in the wind, and I could make out figures moving on deck. Was it a merchant vessel, a pirate ship, a Navy frigate? We did not know. I turned to Friday. This could be our chance. He nodded but did not speak. His eyes were wary. We gathered what little supplies we had left: water, dried meat, and our weapons just in case. Then we moved closer to the beach, watching as the ship finally dropped anchor just beyond the shallow waters. A small boat was lowered, and then they came, a meeting with strangers. 4 men rowed toward the shore, their faces unreadable as they neared. The boat scraped against the sand, and one of them, the tallest, with a thick beard and sharp eyes, stepped out first. He looked around, his expression a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Who are you?" he asked, his English crisp, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to giving orders. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Words felt foreign on my tongue, rusty from years of isolation. "My name is Robinson," I finally answered, my voice hoarse. "I was shipwrecked here years ago." The men exchanged glances. The leader took a step forward. "Robinson Crusoe?" Hearing my full name after so long sent a strange chill down my spine. I had almost forgotten what it sounded like. "Yes," I said. His face softened. "Then you are a very lucky man." The story of the world left behind. They took us aboard. Their ship, a British merchant vessel bound for the Caribbean. As I stepped onto the wooden deck, the world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. The scent of the sea was familiar, yet the polished wood, the sight of men working the sails, the voices of an actual crew, it was all overwhelming. I had lived for so long in silence, surrounded only by nature. Now, the noise of civilization crashed over me like a wave. The captain, whose name was William Ashford, listened intently as I told my story. I spoke of the storm that had wrecked my ship, the long years of solitude, and the arrival of Friday. He nodded, his expression serious. "The world has changed in your absence," he said. "Wars have been fought. Kings have died. Empires have grown and fallen. You will return to a world that is not the same as the one you left." I let that sink in. Had I changed too much to fit into the world I had once known? The price of civilization. For days, we sailed toward South America, where I would have the opportunity to board a ship back to England. Life on the vessel was both familiar and strange. I no longer felt like a man of the sea. My hands, once calloused from ropes and sails, had become hardened by jungle work instead. I was different now. Friday, too, was struggling. He did not understand the structure of the ship, the way men took orders, the rules and regulations of this world. He had always lived as a free man, bound only by the laws of nature. One evening, as we stood by the railing, he turned to me. "You go home?" he asked. I hesitated. "Yes." "You happy?" It was a simple question, but the answer was not so simple. I had spent years longing to return to England, but now I was no longer sure what awaited me there. Would I still belong in that world, or had I become a man of the island, forever changed by my time in exile? Man of Two Worlds. The ship docked in Brazil first, and I found myself standing on land that was once my home. The sugar plantation I had built all those years ago was still there, though it had grown far beyond what I had left behind. Old acquaintances greeted me with shock and disbelief. I was a man who had been presumed dead, a ghost who had returned from the sea. But I did not feel at home. The city was loud. The streets were filled with people, merchants shouting, carts rolling past. The smell of spices and roasting meat filled the air, mingling with the sweat of the laborers. I saw wealth, power, corruption, and greed. Had I once been a part of this? I had lived on an island where there was no money, where survival was the only currency that mattered. Now, I stood in a world where men killed for gold, where people measured success not by what they built with their hands, but by how much they owned. I turned to Friday, who stood beside me, watching the chaos unfold. His expression was unreadable, but I knew what he was thinking. This world was not for him, a choice to make. We had the chance to leave for England. The ship was waiting. The captain had secured passage for us. But as I stood on the dock, looking at the busy port, at the world I had once longed to return to, I realized something. I did not belong here anymore. I was no longer the same man who had left England all those years ago. I had changed. I had become something different, someone who understood the world in a way that few men did. I turned to Friday. "Do you want to stay?" He looked at me, eyes searching. "You?" I took a deep breath. "No, I don't think I do." For the first time, I truly understood what I had to do. I would not return to England. I would return to the island, to the home I had built with my own hands, to the life I had forged in the wilderness, to the freedom I had earned. The return. When tid setain, I told the captain my decision. He looked at me as if I were mad. "Are you sure?" he asked. I smiled. Yes. And so, instead of sailing to England, we set sail back toward the island. The moment I stepped onto the shore again, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I had been given the chance to leave. But in the end, I chose to return. Not as a prisoner, not as a castaway, but as a man who had found his true home. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.